Alrighty, big day today. We're gonna finish welding up the roof, or we're gonna start welding up the roof on our chopped 1953 Chevy truck cab. When I chopped the top on this truck, I did it the most complicated way possible because it makes more content and it makes things more difficult for me, so why not? So not only did I have to lengthen the roof here, I went up through here like so or something like that, I can't remember, but we also had to widen the back of it. So all of this now has to be welded. Isn't that fun? I don't know what else to say, it's just welding, so let's get started. Alright, we got this section welded here, and didn't even mess up the roof as bad as I thought it was going to. I mean, it definitely sucked it in, but not like catastrophically bad. I didn't weld all the way down here because I'm going to be putting a different back window in this, so I don't really care about, you know, any of this. But what's going to happen here is I'm going to just get this area roughed in and back into shape before I start on this seam here, because if I weld all of this and this all at once, it's going to be hard to determine, you know, where the warpage is coming from exactly. And so I want to get this back in line and just focus on fixing one problem at a time rather than creating one massive problem across the entire roof. One thing I did do differently here, well, not necessarily differently, but just something to point out, is I welded this original seam through here. I welded this side, and then I let this completely cool down, and then I did this side here. And rather than just, you know, weld all this and then immediately weld this while it was still hot, and that just kind of helped it, you know, from sucking in a whole bunch, because this is a pretty narrow strip, and what usually happens with this is these just act like a heat sink and just suck everything in if you put all the heat into it all at once. So it's better to do like one consistent pass, let it cool, and then another pass once it's cool. I don't know. At least that's what I've found anyways. It seems to work better. You probably also notice, well, it's kind of hard not to notice, I have this little attachment here clecoed onto the roof. Now this isn't actually like bracing anything, is basically just a profile gauge, so I can kind of determine you know, if this roof is moved around on me or not as I welded it. So that's just the purpose there, just so I can maintain the original shape of the roof. Now I made this profile gauge before I cut this roof up and chopped it, so this is the factory contour of the roof, and we're just trying to keep that. It really helps to have that information available rather than just trying to blindly guess how this all is supposed to look when we're done. What I don't understand though is how I haven't run out of welding gas yet. It's been on E for quite a while now. So in this case, because the weld area had sunk in low, I started out just by bumping it up using this dolly here. And I just kind of go in from the back and essentially just use it as a hammer to knock up the low areas. And you'll see me throughout the video kind of do this occasionally to bump up low spots. When working on older cars with thick metal and a lot of very high crown panels, I find it helps to just get the metal moving in the right direction before I get too far into it. I certainly wouldn't be using this for bumping up low spots on like a flat, roof skin, like on this car here. Because then we would end up just overstretching the metal like really quite badly. So we would use less aggressive methods on lower crown panels. Best not to get too carried away with this because you can certainly go too far even on the higher crown panels and the thicker panels. And the more divots and bumps you put into the metal, the more you have to repair later on. After roughing in the shape, I just use a dolly on the backside, like so, and I planish using my hammer on the outside. So we're essentially squishing the metal in between the hammer and the dolly to stretch the weld area. Now we already did some stretching just by using this to bump up the low areas. So we have to be conscious that we don't go too far with either or. Depending on how aggressive you are, if you do this lightly, then it has more of a smoothing effect. If you really push on the back of this as you're hammering, then it will have more of a stretching effect. Another option that I use for stretching the weld area is I have a flatter dolly like this one here, and I hold this on the outside and I go in from the inside with this hammer, and same deal, I hammer that metal into here, and again we're planishing or stretching that weld area out and allowing it to form its correct shape. So the problem we're running into on this project is, I'll draw out a thing, but imagine we're looking at the back of the cab from this angle here. So we superimpose the image on this door. There's the back window, and there's the back of the roof. That's a pretty terrible drawing. Looks like we drew that big red monster from Looney Tunes. But anyways, what's happened here is we've planished and worked our weld area. There's the little strip that we welded in. And so now this is at the correct height, but we have this weird dip here surrounding it. And that means that we now have to work a much larger area than what was actually affected by the weld. And the reason for that is because we have widened this roof. We have split it apart, added 3/4 of an inch to the middle, and thus completely disrupted the shape. The shape of this roof is supposed to be, you know, one cohesive, nice, flowing profile like that. But because we added this strip here, it's no longer that shape. So it's got a weird spot in it. And so now I'm having to work outside of the weld area, bump these areas up, and get all of this shape to flow together. This is why when we're modifying stuff, we always have to stand back and actually look at the entire vehicle and or whatever we're working on from a distance. You know, we can get all of this, our welded area, looking perfect and, you know, nice and clean and whatever, and then it looks fine, but you stand back and it's got this weird look to it. I see this happen a lot on vehicles that are widened and or lengthened or whatever, and it's always happened to me in the past too. And it took me a long time to figure out like what was going on. Like, you know, I'd have my welds all worked out nice, looks good, stand back, doesn't look right. And that's because we've completely changed the shape of the panel. So obviously we have to rework the entire shape of the panel to get it to look right again. So this is where it gets a lot more complicated than just simply welding in a patch panel where we only have, you know, one seam to weld and, you know, everything is supposed to just fit together like factory. Well, that's, you know, relatively straightforward. You only have to get that to look right again. But when we start adding filler strips, well, even though we only added a 3/4 inch filler strip, we've affected a much larger area of the roof. The bigger the filler strip we add, the more we widen or try to add or subtract, the more of a problem we're going to have getting everything to line back up again. The shape of the panel is always more important than trying to get a nice finished weld seam. This you never see when it's done. The first thing you see is the shape of the vehicle and the shape of all the panels and how they fit together. This is of course very similar to dent repair theory, same concept. Always be considerate of the entire panel as we're working it. Say we have a low crown panel like this, we have a little door ding in it, and what's happened is that crater or that whatever from the ding has pushed up material around and created a high spot. So I can take my filler and I can fill this ding here, but when we go back and we stand back and we look at the panel, there's still going to be a weird high spot in the panel. And well, let's say we fill out a little bit further. We go out to here. Well, even when we stand back now, well, we still have a weird lump going on in the middle of the panel. It might be less noticeable depending on the shape of the panel, but if you have a really flat panel and you try doing this to little door ding, well, or whatever, you know, it's gonna still be noticeable in the final product. I know people always give Bad Chad a hard time for using too much filler or whatever, but actually his flood the ocean floor analogy is something I absolutely do agree with, because if you float over the entire panel, flood the entire panel, and then sand it, and as soon as you start to see metal showing through, well, then it's time to stop. If you still have low spots, then you fill it again and you coat the entire panel, get the entire panel straight, and then you don't notice these weird spots in the panel. The panel is all one cohesive, smooth transition. It looks right when you stand back from it. There's no goofiness, waviness going on. It applies to a lot more than just doing metal work. It applies to filler work, it applies to dent repair, you know, general body work, everything. So what you're seeing me use is called a bullseye pick, and if you've been watching for any amount of time, you've already seen me use this 100,000 times, but every time I post a video, everybody asks, so there it is. It's called a bullseye pick, and basically it has a bullseye on it, right here, and a pick. And when you bring it together, it raises up only the metal that is in this area here. Now, in stock format, these come with a very aggressive tip, which we'll show you later, and it is way too aggressive for using on sheet metal. So what I've done is I took that and I ground it flat so it raises up a much larger area. So once I get the shape roughed in and it's starting to kind of look like something, then I use this for the smaller low areas. You don't want to go to this too soon, because what ends up happening is you create kind of like a crater or minefield or whatever you want to call it, and it just creates more work to fix, and you don't actually get the metal pumped up enough, and it's just, you waste a lot of time going to this too early. So it's kind of more for the later stages, but very handy tool to have. I bought this one from Eastwood years ago, and I pretty well wore it out, so I actually need a new one, but it still kind of works, so good enough for the junk I work on anyways. After all the clanking and banging and mess making in the earlier stages, we're kind of left with a rough surface. And so what I use, or what I've started using now, is called a shrinking disc. And this is just a stainless steel disc on a grinder. And what happens is this contacts the high areas, and the friction from the disc hitting the high areas creates heat, and that heat actually shrinks the metal. And because this is a large area, we're able to kind of shrink large areas. You'll see me work across the area that I had been, working with the hammers and the dollies and the various implements of destruction. And I just kind of wash over that with this. As with all of this, is just doing things in small increments rather than trying to do everything in one big aggressive step. So it's a lot of fiddly repetition. It's kind of a handy safeguard, because if you kind of go too far with something or whatever, this will bail you out. And the important thing with any of this though is to just, again, like I said, just do things in very small increments. Check your progress, check how the panel looks, work it a little at a time. Don't try to be a hero and do everything in one big step. People always complain because I fast forward stuff and whatever, but the thing is it's really hard to actually see progress in real time. It is a slow process, or it should be a slow process. And actually, by going slow, we're actually faster, because we're not creating more damage and more work for us that we have to fix later on. So it's important to notice problems before they become big problems, because big problems are much harder to fix. This is actually going back to the old school days of bodywork. Way back in the day, guys would use a dull grinding disc on their big body grinders and essentially do the same thing. The friction from the dull grinding disc would heat up the metal and shrink those high areas. I've done that in the past, or that's the way I used to do it, is just use a dull grinding disc on a grinder. And now that I have this is definitely a lot more effective. So this is just a progression of that same concept, but much more effective, and you don't run the risk of, removing material with a grinding disc that may still have some bite to it. Final step in the process is another old school trick. This is just a body file, or a vixen file as they're supposedly called, or supposed to be called. And this is just kind of scratching up the surface and telling us if whatever small high or low spots we have remaining. This is the final step. We don't want to switch over to this too early, because if you start taking stuff down when it's got big high spots and stuff, you run the risk of removing material, and all we're essentially trying to do is just scratch up the surface to see where the highs and lows are. The sanding block, it's like trying to block sand Bondo with 400 grit that you just applied. Like, it's a bit too fine, so it tends to go over the highs and lows and give you a false reading, whereas this is like the final judge, executioner, and jury and all that stuff. It tells you exactly what's going on. Whatever remaining problem areas should be very easy to fix. Usually, if I do all these other steps, it takes very, very minimal work to finish out with this. And again, this is old school. It's not really used anymore, but you know, this is what was used on these trucks and vehicles when they were new in body shops, so I still use it. This tool works very good in conjunction with our bullseye pick. Again, both are kind of final finishing tools. Any low spots we encounter, the file will show us, and we can pick them up with this, refile, and once the file scratches those low spots, we know that they're level. The trick with this is to go along the flat of the panel, just like you would, you know, if I was using a sanding block on primer or body filler, we want to go across this way. We don't want to go up and down like this, because what that's going to do is we're going to run the risk of starting to damage the metal, and it's not going to get anything straight. You know, you don't get a car straight by going up and down across the panel. You know, if we were blocking primer, we would go across like this. So we file the same way. We do 30-degree sweeps essentially like this in a crosshatch pattern, and that's going to get us our best results. Going like this, well, it's not going to do anything. It's only going to do damage, and just the panel's going to be wavy. You can also buy an adjustable file holder for these, and these adjustable ones, you just turn this turnbuckle here, and you can either make it for a reverse curve, or you can go the other way. I don't know, you should be able to see that. You can curve it this way, and this works really good on high crown panels like curved fenders from the 1930s, or like curved roof panels, high crown roof panels and stuff like that. So that's where I would use this. You can loosen it off and do flat panels with this, but I find the hardwood handle with the flat surface is much more effective on flat panels for getting them straight. Sometimes this will kind of flex as you're working it and give you a false reading, whereas this is just straight, just like a flat block. All right, well, a couple minutes later, and we got this kind of smoothed out, except for down here, because I think we already mentioned, but the back window is getting changed. So we don't care about anything down here. No point in wasting time on that. And also up in this area, we're going to be beating on that quite substantially for when we weld this seam here. So not worried about that too much. Just wanted to get this area kind of dialed in here. And if you look here, we can see these spots here. This is where there was some misalignment between this filler strip and the metal here. This metal on this side is slightly lower than this side. And the beauty of TIG welds is that we can actually correct this now. With a MIG weld, you're kind of stuck with that unless you go back and weld it again, which I don't really recommend doing that, filling your low spots in with weld, because every time you weld, it introduces more heat and more shrinkage, and then you have to grind it, and that's more heat. It just isn't worth it to get it that slightly bit better to make it disappear. So if it's a MIG weld, I would just leave that. But we can fix this because it's a nice soft weld, so we're gonna fix it. Why not? So what I've done here is I put the Metal Destroyer 5000 on our bullseye pick here. I don't use this very often. You see it's a very sharp point there, so it's kind of useless most of the time, but for plucking up this little junk like this, it just works dandy. And you can see our little misalignment there has completely disappeared. All we did was just pluck up the low area next to the weld, and it completely disappears. So there you go. So all that's left now, at least for this area, is just to sand over with a dual action sander with 80 grit. And then this area will be complete. And then we can move on to the behemoth that is this roof seam, which is not going to be quite as easy. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you important updates from the Battle of the Blue Chair. 10:36 a.m. Allen's fortress is under siege from an unknown assailant. The attack is fearsome, aggressive, and completely uncalled for. Despite all this, morale remains high, and Allen begins plotting and scheming for an impressive counterattack. The attackers, seemingly unprepared for such bold resistance, quickly gather their things and retreat, possibly to regroup and attack later. Understandably pleased with another great victory, Allen perches atop his throne and watches as the attackers flee into the distance. Historians are still debating the events that occurred between 10:36 and 10:45 a.m. All we know for sure is that Allen's fortress has fallen. Although we may never know what really happened on this fateful day, most historians agree that Allen simply abandoned his fortress because he grew weary of having his 18-hour nap rudely interrupted every 30 seconds. This has been a Battle of the Blue Chair update. And here's the final result, or at least as far as we're going to take it. There's where we welded it there. You can see a slight difference in color from the filler material that we added in when we welded it. But other than that, I'm fairly pleased with the shape and everything else of this panel. It doesn't really appear to have been cut and spliced and whatever, which is what we want. You know, these dark spots and everything around here, this is all just rust pitting from sitting, you know, with no paint on it for who knows how many years. So we can't really dig that out and get rid of that. That's fine though. It's not really that's just the joy of working on old junk, I guess. So yeah, that's that. Obviously we still have to work a pretty large area here, and we still have to weld all this, so that's going to be the next video. This is where the challenge comes in. This was easy. This is a walk in the park. This is, I don't know how well this is going to turn out yet. This roof, yeah, it's going to be a lot of work to make this look right, and we're going to be working a pretty big area of this roof, almost probably the whole roof, to try and get everything blended together. And so yeah, stay tuned for more suffering, I guess. So yeah, there's some ancient bodywork secrets revealed, or whatever clickbait nonsense title this video is going to have. Hope there was some helpful advice there for you working on your project. I noticed when I read the comments that some people kind of might get the wrong idea that I don't like body filler, or cars that have body filler in them. And I mean, I hate sanding body filler and working with it. That is a fact. But I don't hate vehicles that have body filler. It could have, you know, over an inch of body filler. If it looks cool, then it's a cool car. I really don't care. Thing is that I'm just incredibly cheap. And I don't know how it is where you folks live, but up here in Canada, the price of materials is insane. And it's even more insane than it was a few years ago. So anywhere that I can save money on materials is a good thing. You know, even like the little, like what is it, 0.8 of a gallon, they don't even give you a full gallon of the cheap commodity body filler that you can buy. That is like, I don't know, what is it, probably with tax, like 65 bucks for just one can of that. And then you start pricing out sandpaper, like a roll of 80 grit sandpaper is, I think it was like $100 or something for the Norton stuff. You don't really want to cheap out on sandpaper because it just costs you more using more sandpaper to try and knock it down and whatever, using the cheap stuff. So it's better to go with good sandpaper. But anyways, the price of materials is just absolutely insane. So anywhere that I can save on materials that I don't have to spend, I'm going to try to save it. I can put that money towards things like brakes or glass or things that I actually need to get the vehicle on the road. If it was, you know, I was trying to be successful on this YouTube thing, I would be better off just to weld everything, beat it in and fill it and move on to the next step of the project. And we could get things done a lot faster probably and whatever, but I mean, I'd just be blowing all of the money that the few pesos that I get from the ad revenue, I'd be blowing that all on materials to make the videos, and you know, so that doesn't really make sense. This barely cost me anything in materials. We got one, I think this was a used piece of 80 grit on our sanding block here. We got one piece of sandpaper for the dual action sander, and well, we didn't even use a full grinding disc. This is the nice thing about the TIG weld, is it's so soft. These Norden 3-inch grinding discs that I use, these last a long time, so I'll probably still be able to grind all the welds. What is this, like, I don't know, probably almost 7 feet of weld or more across the middle of this roof. There's 2 seams here, and we'll be able to grind all of that just with this used disc that we also use to grind this. So barely any material cost at all, and hopefully at least, you know, this area of the roof won't need a whole pile of product on it. We still have, you know, we're probably going to have to do some product application on this seam here. This is like I said, a lot more difficult, so I'm not entirely confident in my abilities or my patience to work this out to absolutely perfect. I just don't see that happening, but hopefully we can save a little bit of material on this area anyways, and we got a video out of it, so win-win there. I just want to say thank you for watching, and want to give a big shout out to all the folks who have been sending in the super thanks donations through YouTube, as well as our monthly contributors over on Patreon. As some of you know, we've been having issues with the PayPal donation thing, and I just simply, it's been over a month and I simply don't have the time to deal with that. You know, I could spend a whole day on the phone going back and forth on emails and all this junk, or I could spend a day working on a project and getting things done. So at this point, even if PayPal starts working again, I just don't trust them anymore. So if you'd like to help support the show or contribute in some way, the YouTube super thanks button or Patreon is the best option. And just again, huge thank you to all the folks who have been generously helping out the show. I'll sign off now, and we'll be back again in a week or whenever I get done destroying this roof. It might take longer, I don't know. It's gonna be a mess, so thank you, and see you again soon.